For nearly 90% of Earth's history, life was not a story of conquest. It was a story of containment. For 3 billion years, life was the ocean. The ocean was life. This was the entire, liquid and singular truth. The great, dry and silent continents were not just another part of the world. They were another planet. A sterile, wind-scoured and elemental landscape of raw, oxidized stone, baked by a sun that no living thing had ever truly felt. It was a dead, alien world, waiting for a conqueror that, for eons, did not come. Why? Why did life wait so long? The very water that gave it birth, that cradled it, that fed it, was also its cage. It was not a prison of steel, but a prison of comfort. In the ocean, life did not have to fight the planet. The water itself was a living, supportive, and buoyant cradle. It held the body. It negated the relentless, crushing, and constant pull of gravity. A creature could be a ton of soft, gelatinous tissue, a jellyfish, and it did not need a single bone. The water did the work. The water was the skeleton. The temperature of this great blue womb was stable, a slow, gentle thermal pulse that protected against the sudden, violent and fiery extremes of the outside. The salt, the minerals, the very chemistry of life was held in a perfect, buffered and unchanging solution. And the sun, the great, sterilizing and unfiltered fire of the sky was tamed. In the ocean, the sun was a soft, dappled and greenish-blue light. Its harshest ultraviolet and cell-shattering radiation was absorbed, rendered harmless by the first few feet of the surface. Life in this warm, supportive and gentle medium was safe. It was perhaps too safe. The land, by stark and brutal contrast, was a catalogue of tortures. It was a world that demanded architecture. To leave the water was to feel, for the first, agonizing time, the true, crushing and physical weight of your own body. It was a world that demanded plumbing. The air was not a cradle, it was a thief, a dry, invisible and atmospheric vampire, pulling the essential, life-giving moisture from every exposed, soft cell. To leave the water was to die of dryness, to desiccate, to become a mummified, shriveled husk in a matter of minutes. And it was a world that demanded a new breath. The air was a poison of abundance, a concentration of oxygen so rich and so different that the delicate, wet and feathery gills of the sea would collapse, dry and fail. The land was a world of crushing, of drying and of suffocating. Why would any living thing ever choose to leave? Tonight we will not tell the story of the ocean. We will tell the story of the escape. We journey back to that singular, desperate and impossible moment when a creature, born of the water, first chose the stone. We will explore the greatest, most audacious and most transformative conquest in the history of our planet. This is the story of how life, against all odds, learned to walk on a dead, alien world. This is a slow, quiet excavation of a world that should be impossible. A journey into the deep, dry past. If this is the kind of exploration you value, if this quiet feels like a place you want to return to, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It is a simple gesture, but it helps this channel find others. And please, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is, where you are. To share this descent with a silent global audience is, as always, a quiet comfort. Now, let the world you know fade. Settle into your space, dim the lights. Perhaps listen for the sound of the air in the room. Imagine it not as air, but as the first, dry and elemental wind, blowing across a continent of sterile, silent rock. Let your muscles soften. Let the demands of the day dissolve. We are leaving the world of the known and stepping onto the shore of the impossible. For 3 billion years, the land was not a place. It was a sentence, a statement of pure mineral fact. To understand the scale of the conquest, we must first have the courage to look at the battlefield, to stand on that alien and hostile and silent shore. We must imagine a planet that is, for all purposes, dead. The world of stone was a world without soil. This is a fact that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. There was no soft earth, no dark loam, no rich, fertile ground. There was only rock and the slow grinding dust of its own decay. It was a planetary crust, a sterile mineral landscape of oxidized iron reds, of basalt blacks, and of granite greys. It was a world of grit. The sun in this world was not a life-giver. It was a weapon. The atmosphere, thin and lacking a dense, protective ozone shield, was a faulty filter. The sun's light was a hard, unfiltered and violet-white glare. And it was saturated with a form of energy that is, to all soft life, an executioner, ultraviolet radiation. This was a world being constantly and relentlessly sterilized. Any life that washed ashore, any complex molecule, was scoured, shattered, and unmade by this hard, cosmic fire in a matter of hours. The wind in this world was not a breeze. It carried no scent. It did not move through leaves. It did not carry the smell of damp earth or pine or pollen. It was a dry, abrasive, and elemental force. It was a river of grit, a moving planetary sandpaper, polishing the silent stone mountains and carrying a sterile dust that would settle in the hollows. It was the only thing that moved. The rain in this world was not a blessing. It was not life-giving. The atmosphere, thick with carbon dioxide and sulfur from a billion years of volcanic breath, made this rain a different and more hostile liquid. It was a weak carbonic and sulfuric acid. It fell from a sky of a strange, perhaps brownish-orange tint, and when it landed, it did not nourish, it dissolved. It was a slow, acidic shower, its only purpose to chemically etch the rock, to break the stone down, and to wash its mineral blood, its sterile salts, back into the great, salty prison of the ocean. And the silence. This, perhaps, is the most profound and most calm, chill element of all. It was a world of an almost absolute biological quiet. There was no life. Therefore, there was no sound of life. No insectile hum, no avian call, no reptilian hiss, no mammalian footfall. The only sounds on this continent were the sounds of the planet itself. The deep, geological and non-living sounds. The dry, abrasive hiss of the wind carrying its cargo of sand. The sudden, sharp crack of a rock, splitting as it cooled in the night. The distant booming rumble of a volcano, or the shudder of an earthquake, and the steady, slow drip and gurgle of the acid rain as it carved its first sterile channels in the bare, mineral earth. This was the land. This was the opportunity. It was not a paradise. It was not a welcoming, empty home. It was the other planet, an alien, hostile and elemental world, a fortress of stone, of acid and of radiation. To leave the ocean for this was not an act of exploration. It was an act of pure, desperate, and unimaginable madness. Life was a creature of the water. It was a soft, wet, and vulnerable thing. It was a prisoner of its own, delicate and biological needs. And this prison, this warm, comfortable, and salty cell, was the ocean itself. Life was safe, but it was trapped, held in the comfortable, supportive and buoyant tyranny of the water. The land was a world of stone, a sterile and elemental planet of the dead. The ocean, by contrast, was a world of life. It was a frantic, teeming, 3 billion-year-old soup of it. For eons, this was the only stage that mattered, the only place where the drama of biology was permitted to unfold. But it was a stage with an invisible wall. Why did life wait? Why did it remain, for almost 90% of its own story, a prisoner of the sea? The barrier was not physical, it was biological. It was the simple, profound, and terrible fact that the ocean was easy. The sea was not just a home, it was a cradle. It was a vast, supportive, and all-encompassing life support system, a machine that solved, for free, all of the fundamental problems of existence. Life, in its soft, gelatinous, and single-celled infancy, was a creature of pure convenience. It was a fragile chemical reaction, and the ocean was the perfect, stable, and temperature-controlled beaker. It was a prison of comfort, a tyranny of kindness. The water did all the work. First, it solved the problem of temperature. The land was a place of schizophrenic thermal violence, a desert frozen solid by night and baked into a cracked, sterile pavement by noon. The ocean, by contrast, was a planetary battery, a vast thermal mass. It holds its heat. It changes its temperature by a degree over a season, not an hour. Life's delicate, enzymatic machinery was tuned to this one, slow and gentle pulse. The land was a jarring, chaotic, and fatal noise. It solved the problem of moisture. This was the most profound and most defining gift. Life is water. A living cell is a tiny, delicate, and wet bag of chemistry. In the ocean, you are a wet thing, living in a wet world. You are in perfect osmotic equilibrium. The air, that dry, thirsty, and invisible thief, is 1,000,000 miles away. You do not need complex, waterproof skin. You do not need intricate, internal plumbing. You are safe, and it solved the problem of the sun. On land, the sun was a sterilizing, ultraviolet fire, a rain of hard, cell-shattering radiation. In the sea, the water was a shield. The sun was a gentle, filtered, and life-giving food, a soft, blue-green light that fueled the great foundational engines of the algae. But the greatest and most insidious gift of all was the gift of support. The water held life. It is a buoyant, forgiving, and structural medium. In the ocean, you do not need to fight the planet. A creature could be a ribbon, a formless, gelatinous bell, a soft, digestive mat. It did not need bones. It did not need a stem. It did not need architecture. The water was its skeleton. The water held it, embraced it, and in this, it made life possible. This was the trap. This was the tyranny. For 3 billion years, life was, by its very nature, soft. It was weak. It had outsourced its entire physical structure to the liquid that held it. It had no concept of its own, physical, independent form. It had no understanding of its own weight. To leave the water was not just to face the dry, burning air or the hard violet light. It was to feel, for the first agonizing and truly terrible time, the full, crushing, and relentless pull of the planet. It was to meet the first, the most brutal, and the most fundamental of the great evolutionary filters, the filter of gravity. In the ocean there was no up, or rather up was simply a direction, a place of warmer water, of brighter light. It was not a struggle. The water held you. Buoyancy was a gift, a constant structural embrace. A creature could be a ribbon of soft, delicate tissue. It could be a formless, gelatinous bell. It had no need of bones, of stems, of architecture. It was a living, organized, and structural cloud. And then life washed ashore. In that single, wet, and gasping moment, it met the tyrant. It learned for the first, terrible time, the true, crushing, and vertical nature of the planet. It learned its own weight. This was the first great filter, gravity. It is the most impersonal, the most ancient, and the most unforgiving law of this universe. And it is a law that, in the ocean, had been suspended. On land, it was absolute. Imagine a soft-bodied worm or a delicate frond of algae washed from the supportive, liquid cradle onto the hard, sterile, and unforgiving stone. In the sea, it was a dancer, a form of liquid, floating grace. On the land, it was a puddle, a smear of dissolving, helpless jelly. Its own soft and delicate body, the very thing that made it alive, became a fatal, crushing, and inescapable prison. It could not hold itself up. It could not move. It could not even breathe, its own wet and delicate respiratory surfaces collapsing in on themselves, a living, suffocating mass. This was the first and most profound riddle of the land. Before life could move, before it could hunt, before it could hide, it first had to learn how to stand. It had to become an engineer, an architect. It had to invent, from nothing, the concept of structure. This was a war waged not with fang or claw, but with cellular engineering. It was the invention of the column. For the plants, this was the creation of cellulose, and then the revolutionary, rigid and defiant miracle of lignin. It was the birth of the stem, a scaffold against the sky, a rigid, vertical and structural no to the tyrant of gravity. For the animals, it was the invention of the frame. It was the exoskeleton, the hard, external and articulated suit of armor that gave the first arthropods a new, rigid and jointed form. And much later, it would be the skeleton, the deep, internal and vertebrate architecture of bone, a living, growing and internal scaffolding. Life had to build a frame just to hold its own, living and sacred self up, 1 inch, off the dead, mineral earth. This was a war, not against a predator, but against the planet itself, against its most fundamental and unavoidable law. This was the first and most fundamental act of the conquest. It was a victory of architecture. The first creatures, the first plants, had solved the problem. They had built their towers. They had built their frames. They could stand. But in standing, they had exposed themselves to the second great filter. They had lifted their wet, delicate and ocean-borne bodies out of the water and into the air. And the air, in its own silent and thirsty way, was a far more insidious and far more patient kind of thief. So life had learned to stand. It had built its frame, its stem, its rigid internal and external architecture. It had, in a great structural and cellular act of pure defiance, said no to the tyrant of gravity. It had won. But this victory was a trap. This one vertical solution, this act of standing up, created a new and far more insidious horizontal problem. In solving the puzzle of its own weight, life had merely lifted its soft, wet and ocean-borne body into the single, worst and most hostile place it could possibly be. It had lifted itself into the air. This was the second great filter, the filter of the dryness. The air is a thief. It is an invisible, atmospheric and thirsty void. And it has one single, relentless and chemical imperative: to pull water from wherever it is and to take it. It is the universe's great drying engine. And life, in its most fundamental and most delicate and most sacred essence, is water. A living cell is not a hard, dry and static object. It is a tiny personal ocean, a microscopic, trembling and gelatinous bag of complex, liquid chemistry, held in a thin, permeable and trusting membrane. In the ocean, this was not a problem. The wet, internal and salty world was in perfect osmotic balance with the wet, external and salty world. It is a life of easy, liquid equilibrium. On land, this was a fatal and immediate contradiction. Imagine that first amphibious plant, that Cooksonia, that pioneer. It has its new, rigid and woody stem. It stands, a few inches tall, a green, proud and vertical miracle on the shore of the stone. And the wind blows, that dry, elemental and scentless wind we imagined. It is not a gentle breeze, it is an act of atmospheric theft. The wind moves in a dry, invisible and silent river across the plant's soft, wet and unprotected skin, and it begins to leach the life from it. Molecule by molecule, the water, The plant's very blood, its internal hydraulic pressure, is stolen, pulled out into the vast, thirsty, and uncaring sky. The plant does not just get thirsty, it begins to fail. The tiny architectural cells, the very rigid walled structures that held it up against gravity, lose their internal pressure, their turgor. The plant wilts. Its proud, vertical, and hard-won victory is undone in an afternoon. It collapses, a limp, green, and dying rag, returning to the horizontal world it had just so bravely escaped. For the first, scuttling, soft-bodied animal, it was even faster. Imagine a worm, a soft, ancestral, and gelatinous creature washed ashore. Its skin, that soft, wet, and living membrane that was a perfect respiratory surface in the sea, now became a death sentence. The air pulled the moisture from its body with a terrible chemical violence. Its cells began to shrivel, to pucker, to crenate. Its own internal salty ocean evaporated. It became a dry, mummified and brittle husk, a salty organic stain on the hot, alien and unforgiving stone. This was the new death. It was not the sudden, crushing and physical violence of gravity. It was a quiet, patient and atmospheric execution. To conquer the land, life did not just need an architect to build a frame. It needed a plumber. It needed first to invent a wall. It had to find a way to seal its personal, internal and precious ocean inside itself. It had to invent a new and revolutionary and waterproof skin. And in solving that, it would create the third and final great filter. For in sealing itself off from the air, it also sealed itself off from its own available breath. It had to learn for the first terrible and impossible time how to breathe a poison. Life had found a solution. It had built its frame against the tyrant of gravity. It had conceived of a new waterproof skin against the thief of the dry air. It was sealed, it was dry, it was standing, and in this it had created the third, most immediate and most lethal paradox. It could no longer breathe. The air, that dry, invisible and thirsty ocean, was a poison of abundance. In the sea, oxygen was a scarce, precious and dissolved commodity. Life, in its cold-blooded, slow-moving and aquatic form, had evolved a miracle to harvest it: the gill. A gill is not a simple object. It is a masterpiece of biological architecture. It is a feathery, intricate and fractal curtain of hyper-thin, wet tissue. It is a surface area so vast and so delicate that it can find and absorb the few, stray and dissolved molecules of oxygen that drift past. And it is wet, it must be. The exchange of gas, the very act of breath, can only happen across a liquid, permeable and living membrane. The water, that ancient, supportive cradle, made this miracle possible. The water flowed, constantly, through these delicate, feathery curtains, bringing the oxygen to them. The water supported their delicate, vast and complex structure, holding them open, allowing them to work. And then life, in its new, waterproof and arrogant skin, stood up. It left the water, and it met the air. The air was rich in oxygen, 1,000 times richer. This was not a gift, it was a curse. This richness was in a gas, a dry and thirsty gas. The gill, that perfect aquatic and wet-based machine, was now exposed to its one true and fatal enemy: the dryness. In a single, agonizing and final minute, the air, the thief, performed its work. It stole the moisture from those delicate, feathery and life-giving curtains. The gills dried, and a dry gill is not a gill. It is a piece of dead, useless and mummified tissue. The gas exchange stops. At the same exact instant, the second enemy, the tyrant gravity, performed its work. The water was no longer there to support those delicate, feathery and fractal structures. The gills, in their own wet and now unsupported weight, collapsed. They became a single, clotted and useless mass of clumping, dead flesh. This was the third and most immediate death. The creature was surrounded by oxygen. It was standing in a sea of pure, unadulterated fuel, and it was suffocating. It was drowning in the open air. This was the great, final, and biological riddle of the land. Life had to solve all three problems at the same time. A creature could not solve gravity without solving the dryness, and it could not solve the dryness without also solving the problem of breath. The waterproof skin, that brilliant, life-saving solution to the dryness, was also the wall. You could not breathe through it. The solution, therefore, could not be external. The solution had to be internal. Life had to invent a new and far stranger kind of machine. It had to take the ocean with it. It had to build a small, protected, and personal sea, a hidden, internal, and permanently wet chamber, deep inside its new, dry, and armored body. A place where the dry, poisonous, and abundant air could be forced to meet the wet, delicate, and ancient membrane of life. It had to invent a lung. These were the three great filters: gravity, dryness, and breath. Three impossible, interlocking, and simultaneous problems. The conquest of the land was not a single brave step. It was the solving of a three-part biological and existential riddle, and the first and strangest conqueror, the one that solved all three millions of years before any animal, was not a conqueror at all. It was the foundation. This was the great biological stalemate, a three-part, interlocking, and impossible riddle. To conquer the land, you had to be waterproof, but to be waterproof, you had to invent a lung. But to use a lung, you had to be strong enough to stand up. But to stand up, you had to be. It was a circle of biological impossibility. The animal kingdom could not solve it. The plant kingdom could not solve it. For hundreds of millions of years, the great, sterile, and silent world of stone remained inviolate. The conqueror, when it finally came, was not a conqueror at all. It was not an animal. It was not a plant. It was the other kingdom, the third, the foundation. The first, successful and permanent life to leave the ocean was the lichen. And a lichen is not an it. A lichen is a they. It is not a single organism. It is a desperate, brilliant, and symbiotic marriage. It is a partnership, a biological treaty signed between two completely different and hopeless refugees. The first partner was the fungus. This was the architect, the builder, the structure. It was a creature of the dark, a master of chemistry, but it had no way to make its own food. It could not eat the sun. The second partner was the algae. This was the engine, the food source, a simple green and single-celled life, a pure photosynthetic machine. But it was soft, gelatinous, and utterly defenseless. It had no structure, it had no protection. Apart, they were both failures. The algae, washed ashore, would be a smear of green jelly, sterilized by the sun and dried by the air in an hour. The fungus, arriving as a spore, would find a world of pure, indigestible, and mineral rock. It would starve. Together, they were a new thing, a composite being, a creature that was its own, perfect and self-contained ecosystem. This was the lichen, and it was the first and only thing that could solve the three-part riddle. It solved gravity, not by fighting it, but by ignoring it. It did not need to stand up. It was a crust. It was a living, biological stain, a tough, leathery mat that simply clung to the stone. It let the rock be its skeleton. It solved the dryness. The fungus became the skin. The tough, dense, and interwoven fungal threads created a hard, waterproof, and leathery fortress, a living, microscopic house. And inside this house, it held its partner, the delicate, green, and precious algae, in a state of permanent, internal, and protected moisture. It was a biological canteen, and in this, it solved the final problem: breath and food. The algae, safe from the dry air, safe from the ultraviolet fire, and bathing in its own internal fungal-held moisture, did the one thing it knew how to do. It ate the light. It became the internal solar-powered engine, pumping a constant, reliable and liquid stream of sugar, of pure chemical energy, directly into the fungal body that was its house, its armor, and its world. This being was a miracle. It was a self-contained, self-repairing, solar-powered and waterproof pioneer. It could live on nothing. It could live on pure, sterile and elemental stone. But it did not just live on the stone, it ate it. This was the true, final and world-changing genius of the partnership. The fungus, the master alchemist, in its dark, patient and relentless way, began its chemical assault on the planet itself. It began to unmake the world of stone. This new composite creature, this lichen, was not just a survivor, it was a digestive system. It was a slow, planetary-scale machine for turning the dead, mineral world into a living, biological one. The fungal partner, the master alchemist, was at work. It began its assault. This was a war waged with chemistry, a slow, patient, and relentless siege. The fungal hyphae, the living threads, exuded their acids. These were not the violent, smoking acids of a laboratory. They were subtle, organic, and precise. They were chemical keys designed to slip into the crystalline locks of the rock's surface. They unmade the stone. The acid seeped into the granite, the basalt. It found the essential, trapped, and useless minerals. It found the iron, the phosphorus, the potassium, and one by one, it unlocked them. It tore them, molecule by molecule, from their mineral prison and pulled them into its own living, biological body. This was the first act of mining, the first true taste of the land. And in this act of chemical theft, the fungus did not just feed itself, it shattered the world. The rock, its surface now etched, dissolved and chemically compromised, was no longer a solid, defiant wall. It was weak, it was porous, and now the other elemental forces could join the attack. The rain, that weak, acidic water, now had a place to pool. The wind, that dry, abrasive river of grit, now had a new, rough surface to scour. But the greatest ally was the cold. The water, which now seeped into these new fungal-made cracks, would freeze, it would expand, and with a force that is silent, slow, and more powerful than any dynamite, it would push the rock apart from the inside, a single, sharp, and inaudible crack. A grain of sand was born. This was the first part of the recipe. The mineral, the grit, the pulverized, eaten, and shattered remains of the world of stone. But this was not soil. It was just dead, wet, and sterile dust. It lacked the second and most essential ingredient. It lacked death. The lichen, this pioneer, this conqueror, had to die, and it did. After a life of slow, photosynthetic patience, the lichen would reach its end. And its body, that tough, leathery, and nutrient-rich mat, would not wash away. It would stay. It would fall onto the grit that it, itself, had just created. This was the second ingredient, the organic. And now, for the first time in the history of the planet, the two worlds met. The dead stone and the dead life. And in that mixture, in that thin, greasy, and chemical-rich paste, a new thing was born. A substance that was not just rock and not just life. It was a bridge between them. It was the first true soil. It was a thin, dark, and living skin, a biological membrane stretched for the first time over the raw, mineral bones of the planet. It was a new and revolutionary and welcoming world. It held water, it held nutrients, it held a future. This skin, this new, soft and fertile ground, was the end of the long, sterile, and 400 million year long reign of the stone. And it was an invitation It was a welcome mat laid down by the first humble and fungal pioneers. It was a message sent to the other, more complex and still waiting life, the life that was trapped, biding its time in the safe, soft and shallow margins of the sea. The message was simple. We have built the shore. The land is ready. And the plants, the green and timid and amphibious plants, were the first to hear the call. The invitation was sent. This new, thin, living skin of soil was a chemical promise. It was a message of welcome, a soft, wet and nutrient-rich bed laid down by the patient and alchemical stone-eaters. And from the crowded, sunlit and competitive shallows, the green kingdom accepted. The first plants stepped out of the water. They were not the giants we know. They were not the great, woody titans of the future, the lords of lignin. They were, at first, a simple green fuzz, a damp, low and humble carpet of the first true mosses, a living green stain that, for the first time, began to colour the grey mineral world. And then came the first true vertical act. We see it in the rock, a creature called Cooksonia. It was a being of pure, simple and vertical ambition. Imagine it, a green, naked and forking stem, no leaves, no flowers, no true deep-seeking roots. It was just a stalk, a few brave and leafless inches of green, standing on the new soil. It was the first photosynthetic life to, in its own small and defiant way, stand up. Its entire biological purpose was to lift a small reproductive capsule, a tiny dark and cellular packet, a single small sphere of spores, just a little higher, high enough to catch the wind, that dry, sterile and scentless wind. This was the first green vertical line, drawn against a world that had, until then, been entirely flat. It was a victory, but it was not a conquest. This was a compromise, a desperate biological bargain. This first green pioneer, this Cooksonia, this moss, was not a true conqueror. It was an amphibian. It was a living green contradiction, a creature with one defiant vertical foot on the new hard shore, and its entire ancestral and biological self still chained to the water. It had not solved the great filters. It had merely found a loophole. It had not solved the problem of the dryness. Its skin was not the hard, waxy and waterproof cuticle of a modern leaf. It was still the soft, thin and permeable skin of its aquatic ancestors. It was a living, green and vertical sponge. It was a wick, and the dry, thirsty air was a constant leaching and vaporizing pull. This meant its life was a life of tethering. It could not leave the shore. It could not strike out into the dry, red and open continent. It was a prisoner of the damp. It could only survive in the places where the stone was still visibly wet, in the misty, saturated and humid spray of a waterfall, or on the muddy, saturated and permanent banks of a river. It had left the ocean only to become a slave to the mud. But this physical chain, this need for a wet place, was not its deepest. It was not its most profound prison. Its true and inescapable shackle was genetic. It was a prison of sex. These first amphibious plants, in their ancient, simple and foundational design, still carried the memory of the ocean in their very genesis. They produced a sperm, and this sperm swam. It had a tail. It was a motile, active and microscopic swimmer. This was the trap. For this microscopic, life-giving cell to find its target, to find the egg, it could not travel through the dry, hostile and empty air. It needed a medium. It needed a river. It needed, at the very least, a thin, continuous and unbroken film of morning dew. A single, glistening and transient droplet of rain. This was the amphibious compromise. If the day was too hot, if the air was too dry, if the rain did not fall, an entire generation failed. The conquest stalled. They had come ashore, They had built the first green and vertical lines, but they were, in their essence, still just a part of the water. They had not conquered the land. They had merely brought a small green and temporary patch of the swamp with them. They were slaves to a single, transient drop of rain. The true conquest, the final and definitive breaking of this wet, reproductive chain, would require another and far more profound act of evolutionary genius. But first, these new, green and vertical competitors, these storks, all reaching for the sun, had to solve the other problem. They had to solve the problem of each other. The vertical war, the great, silent and photosynthetic race for the sky, was about to begin. The first green carpet, the mosses and the ankle-high Cooksonia had claimed the wet, sterile margins. They were a two-dimensional solution, a simple, horizontal and amphibious stain of life, a fringe of green on a world of grey. But this new, sun-drenched and mineral-rich continent offered a prize that was not horizontal. It was vertical. The prize was the sun itself. And so a new, silent and desperate war began. This was not a war of tooth and claw. It was a war of architecture. It was a war waged in slow motion with shadows. The first plant that could lift its photosynthetic, green and living skin just 1 single millimeter higher than its neighbor. It won the raw, unfiltered and caloric energy of the star. And in the same victorious and cellular act, it cast a small, dark and fatal shadow of starvation on the competitor just below it. This was the first great and photosynthetic arms race. The evolutionary imperative was simple. It was brutal. Get tall or die. But in this new vertical ambition, life immediately slammed once again into the first great and elemental filter, the tyrant of gravity. A simple, wet and sappy stem, the kind the amphibious Cooksonia possessed, is not a tower. It is a wet noodle. It is a structure of water. It can hold itself a few brave inches against the pull of the earth. But it cannot support a story. It cannot hold weight. To get tall, to build a true, vertical and permanent body, life needed a new material. It needed a biological steel. And in the patient, cellular and sun-fed laboratories of these new ambitious plants, that molecule was forged. Its name was lignin. This was the invention of wood. Lignin was not just a stiffener, it was a revolution. It was a complex, rigid and defiant polymer, a microscopic, three-dimensional and load-bearing scaffold that for the first revolutionary time gave a plant true architectural strength. It was a material that was strong in compression. It could hold its own weight. It was the key that unlocked the third dimension. And this new vertical world became a strange, experimental and alien landscape. This was the age of the first weird vertical ideas. For a time, the giants of this world were not even plants. They were the silent grey and monolithic towers of the fungi, the prototaxites, a strange 30-foot and featureless spire, a fungal experiment in verticality, a kingdom of silent grey pillars. But they were a dead end. They were a tower, but they were not a leaf. They could not eat the light. The true victory belonged to the plants that married this new lignin strength with the old photosynthetic engine. The invention of wood allowed for the invention of the trunk allowed for the invention of the branch, and the branch allowed for the invention of the leaf. This was the birth of the first true forest. We see it in the Devonian rock, great, towering and alien-looking trees like Archaeopteris, a creature that was half fern, half tree, a monstrous, green and 30-foot-tall pioneer. This changed the planet. It created, for the first time, a layered, complex and three-dimensional world, a dark, damp and shaded understory, a place of new low-light specialists, a high, bright and wind-swept canopy, a new aerial habitat. It created a new climate. The air was now filled with the sound of wind moving through leaves. It was filled with the new, rich and damp smell of shade, of wood, and of true, fungal-eaten rot. The plants had won. They had beaten gravity. They had beaten each other. They stood 30, 40, even 50 feet tall, their leaves held, victorious, in the full, hot, unfiltered sun. They were the undisputed kings of the new, green and conquered world. But this victory was, once again, a trap. This 50-foot-tall tower of lignin and leaf was a prison. The leaves, the green solar-powered engines, the food factories, were now 50 feet away from the one other and essential ingredient they needed. They were 50 feet away from the water. The old, simple and amphibious trick of diffusion, of soaking up moisture from the mud, was now a geological impossibility. The plant had built a skyscraper, but it had no plumbing. It had a penthouse, but it had no elevator. The new, victorious and sun-drenched leaves were dying of thirst. The conquest of the land required one final and most ingenious piece of engineering. It had to invent its own internal and private river. The plants had built their towers. They had won the war of shadows, the vertical photosynthetic race for the sun. Their hard, new, lignin bodies stood 50 feet tall, a green, structural and victorious miracle. And they were dying of thirst. The conquest of height had created a new and fatal crisis of distance. The engine, the green, sun-eating leaf, was now 50 feet in the air. The fuel, the cold, mineral-rich water, was 50 feet below in the dark, fungal-eaten soil. And the plant was a skyscraper with no plumbing. The old amphibious solution was now a biological impossibility. A simple moss, a cooksonia, could soak up the dampness of the mud, its body a simple 2-inch passive wick. But water does not climb. It does not, on its own, defy the very tyrant of gravity that the plant had just so painfully conquered. A plant could not suck the water up. It had no muscle. It had no pump. The distance was too great. The problem was absolute. The first great woody forests were a monument to a beautiful and fatal miscalculation. The conquest stalled. Life needed a new invention. It needed an internal, hydraulic and structural miracle. It needed a river that flowed not downhill but up it, a river that could move silently and with great power from the deep, dark root to the high, hot and thirsty leaf. It needed a circulatory system. And in the patient, cellular and evolutionary laboratories of these first great trees, that system was born. We call it the xylem. It is perhaps the most ingenious and most calm-chill piece of engineering on the planet, because this river has an engine. But the engine is not a heart, it is not a pump. The engine is the sun. The system is a paradox of physics. It is a straw. The plant builds inside its woody, lignin-rich stem a series of microscopic, hollow and continuous pipes. These are the xylem. They are, in essence, a bundle of dead, empty and structurally reinforced cells, a perfect internal plumbing. This pipe runs unbroken from the finest, deepest and wettest root hair to the highest, greenest and most sun-drenched leaf. And this pipe is full of water, a single, continuous and unbroken chain of water, held together by the simple, powerful and invisible magic of its own cohesion. The water molecules stick together. The leaf, high in the canopy, is hot. The sun, the unfiltered Devonian sun, is beating down on it. To cool itself, to breathe, the leaf opens a tiny, microscopic and intelligent pore, a stoma. And in that act, a single tiny and sacrificial molecule of water evaporates. It is pulled out by the dry air and by the sun's heat. This one single and microscopic act of evaporation is the engine. As that one single molecule leaves the chain, it pulls. It pulls on the molecule behind it, which pulls on the molecule behind it. which pulls on the molecule behind that. A single silent and chemical tug is transmitted in an instantaneous hydraulic whisper down the entire 50-foot and unbroken chain of water. It is a tug that travels from the leaf, down the branch, down the trunk into the deep, dark soil, and it pulls one new molecule of water into the root. This is the miracle. It is a passive pump, a silent, hydraulic and solar-powered engine that can lift hundreds of gallons of water, hundreds of feet into the air against the full, crushing and absolute force of gravity. It required no muscle. It used no heart. It expended no energy. It is an engine made of physics. This was the internal river. This was the final, ingenious and plumbing solution. And with it, the plants were, at last, free. They were no longer slaves to the mud. They were no longer a green, wet and desperate fringe tethered to the riverbank. The root was now a miner, a deep, seeking and exploratory tool, a thing that could plunge, blind and deep, into the dry, dark earth, searching for the last hidden drop. The leaf was now a solar panel, a high, airy and confident thing, living, breathing and drinking in the full, hot and open sun. The plants had done it. They had solved the three great and interlocking filters: gravity with lignin, dryness with skin, and breath with this new, internal and solar-powered river. The silent, green and stationary kingdom had conquered the land. And in doing so it had, by accident, built a world. It had created a new, vast and three-dimensional habitat, a world of shade, a world of humidity, a world of structure, and it had created a world of food, a rich, green and carbohydrate-filled banquet, laid out, waiting. The stage was set, and the next conquerors, the animals, were about to arrive, and the first to come, the true armored vanguard, were the ones who were, by a perfect evolutionary accident, already wearing a suit. The plants had done it. They had built a new world. The silent, sterile and elemental planet of stone was gone, buried under a new, living and green skin, a world of lignin towers, of photosynthetic engines, of internal rivers, a world that, for the first time, held humidity in its shade, a world that held structure in its branches, a world that held energy in its leaves. This new, green and three-dimensional habitat was an invitation. It was a banquet, a vast, complex and carbohydrate-rich paradise, laid out and waiting. The stage was set. But for what? The old, soft-bodied and amphibious life of the shore was still a prisoner. A snail, a soft-skinned worm. These creatures were still slaves to the damp. They were the tethered. They could visit this new green world, but they could not conquer it. They could not live there. They were still, in their very essence, a piece of the ocean. They were jelly, trapped in a weak, permeable skin, and the dry, thirsty air was still a death sentence. The conqueror, the first animal to truly and definitively leave the water and claim this new, green interior, would need to have solved all three great filters. It would need a frame against gravity. It would need a wall against the dryness. It would need a new and radical engine for breath. And the creature that came, the first true animal pioneer, was not a soft, fumbling and amphibious experiment. It was a finished, polished and perfect machine. It was an arthropod, the ancestor of the spider, the scorpion, the centipede, the insect, and it arrived on this new shore not as a refugee, but as an astronaut. It was, by a perfect, beautiful, and profound evolutionary accident, already wearing a spacesuit. This suit was the exoskeleton, and it was an invention that had nothing to do with the land. It was an invention born 300 million years earlier, in the deep, violent and competitive crucible of the Cambrian seas. It was not architecture, it was armor. It was a hard, chitinous and external shield, a military-grade defense evolved for one purpose: to stop the fangs, the claws, and the crushing jaws of the great oceanic predators. It was a suit of armor against Anomalocaris. This ancient oceanic and military hardware was the accidental key to all three terrestrial locks. First, it solved gravity. This suit of armor, this hard external shell, was a frame. It was a perfect external skeleton, a living, jointed and articulated scaffold. When the first scorpion or centipede pulled itself from the buoyant, supportive cradle of the water, it did not collapse. It did not become a puddle. It stood. Its own military-grade armor, its oceanic defense, became its new terrestrial and structural body. It held its soft, internal and vital organs up against the full, crushing and vertical pull of the planet. Problem 1, solved by accident. Second, it solved the dryness. This chitinous external armor, this shell, was not a soft, permeable and living skin. It was a wall. It was a hard, waxy and biological plastic. It was, by its very nature, waterproof. When the arthropod stood up in its new structural frame and the dry, thirsty and elemental wind began to blow, that wind found nothing to steal. The creature's own precious and internal ocean was sealed, safe and locked inside this pre-built, form-fitting and protective suit. The animal was not a wick, it was a canteen. Problem 2, solved by accident. But this perfect accidental solution, this waterproof, structural suit of armor, created the third and most complex problem. The suit was too good. It was a perfect, hermetic seal. The arthropod was now standing. It was waterproof, and it was suffocating. It could not breathe through its new plastic and impenetrable wall. The old, delicate and external gills were gone, useless, dried, and now sealed away. It had to invent a new way. It did not invent the lung. That was a vertebrate's clumsy internal bag solution. The arthropod invented something stranger, something more distributed. It punctured its own perfect armor. It evolved spiracles, a series of tiny, protected, and most importantly, closable holes, a line of microscopic armored portholes running down the side of its body. These were not open gates. They were airlocks, intelligent, muscular valves that could be opened just a fraction to sip the air, and then snapped shut to trap the moisture. And these airlocks led to the trachea. This was not a single, inefficient lung. This was a direct, internal and silvery network of tubes, a biological ventilation system that branched like a fractal, delivering the dry, gaseous and abundant oxygen directly to the muscle. No blood, no heart, just a direct, efficient and passive delivery. This was the final piece. The suit was built. The plumbing was installed. The arthropod was a perfect, pre-adapted and terrestrial machine. It had solved all three filters with an ingenuity that was born of a pure evolutionary accident. The plants had built the new world. They had laid out the food. And now the first true animal conqueror, encased in its ancient oceanic and military-grade armor, was about to step onto the shore. It was about to take the first definitive and animal step, and in this new, green and silent world, it was about to make the first sound. The new world was built. The green lignin towers of the plants had conquered gravity. The fungal-made soil held a new and life-giving moisture. The internal solar-powered rivers of the xylem were flowing, carrying water 50 feet into the sky. The stage was set, but it was silent. We must try to listen to that silence. It was not the silence of a modern forest at midnight. That is a silence which is full. It is the silence of held breath, of sleeping birds, of the distant high-altitude hum of an insect, a pause between sounds. This was a different and far more elemental quiet. This was the silence of the inanimate. It was a world without a biological voice, The wind moved, but it did not hiss through grass, because grass did not yet exist. It did not rustle leaves, because the first alien club moss leaves were stiff, waxy, and unmoving. It was the sound of a sterile geological engine. The only sounds were the sharp crack of cooling stone, the slow hydraulic gurgle of the internal rivers inside the new trees, and the steady acidic tap of the rain. It was a world waiting for a heartbeat. And then, from the damp, soft, and amphibious margin of the river, a new thing came. It was not a soft refugee. It was not a tethered, gelatinous, and jelly-skinned victim washed ashore. It was a conqueror. It was an astronaut. It was a tank. Imagine Arthropleura, a giant, armored, and segmented millipede, a creature 6, perhaps 8, feet long, a living, articulated, and chitinous train, a low-slung, multi-legged, and relentless machine. It was a being of pure, horizontal, and segmented power. Its armor, that accidental oceanic spacesuit, was not just a passive shield. It was a lever. It was 1,000 tiny and jointed legs, each one a fulcrum, each one a paddle, pushing against the new, soft and fungal-made earth. It pulled its immense, flat body from the supportive wet mud of the swamp. And it paused. This was, perhaps, the first complex animal mind to ever process the dry, open and unfiltered air. It had no lungs. It had its new, efficient and alien trachea. It sipped the air, this new, rich and hot fuel of pure gaseous oxygen. It was, perhaps, the first creature to ever feel the energy of this new world, the metabolic fire that this new, dry atmosphere could provide. Its simple compound eyes, designed for the murky, green and flat light of the swamp, now looked up. It saw a world of impossible, vertical and green structure, a forest of shade, of dampness, a labyrinth of food, of rotting, uneaten and defenseless plant matter, a world with no enemies, a world for the first terrifying and exhilarating time of opportunity. And so, it began to move. It was not a roar. It was not a wet, heavy, vertebrate footfall. It was a scuttling. It was the sound of 1,000 chitinous and multifaceted feet, all moving in a single, undulating and rhythmic wave. This was not the soft, wet plop of a stranded, amphibious fish. This was not the gelatinous slither of a worm. This was a new sound. It was the sound of a hard, manufactured and engineered material, striking a geological one. It was the sound of chitin on stone, a dry, a precise, a rhythmic clicking, a sound that, to our modern ears, would be the sound of a giant mechanical clock. This was the first true animal heartbeat of the new continent. It was the tapping on the door. It was the sound of an armored, relentless, and scuttling invasion, the first true biological voice of the new world. This creature, this armored, ground-bound tank, had claimed the horizontal. It and its cousins, the 8-legged armored spiders, the true scorpions with their new venomous tails, were the masters of the new, dark and damp forest floor. They were the kings of the shade, the monarchs of the understory. They were the first successful animal dynasty. They had claimed the ground. But the new world was not just a floor. The plants had built a tower. They had created a new, vast and unoccupied volume. A new, sun-drenched and open highway 100 feet high. A new and waiting dimension, the air itself. The ground was claimed. The new, green and three-dimensional forest floor, this world of shade and structure, now belonged to the scuttling, armored and jointed vanguard. The clicking, chitinous sound of Arthropleura, the giant millipede, was the new dominant and biological heartbeat of the earth. The land, the horizontal, was conquered. But the true, vast and final prize was still empty. The air. The air was a new and vertical and sun-drenched ocean, An ocean of gas 1,000 times larger and 1,000,000 times more complex than the sea of water that life had just so painfully left behind. But to claim it, this was a new and even more audacious war against the tyrant of gravity. To scuttle was one thing, to fly was another. The animal that solved this riddle once again was the arthropod, the insect, the master of the modular, external and adaptable suit of armor. The first wing was not a wing at all. It was not a soft, feathered and complex miracle of muscle. It was a radiator. In this new, hot and sun-drenched world, the first small terrestrial insects had a problem of heat. Their hard, dark and chitinous armor was a solar oven. So they evolved, in a simple, brilliant and adaptive mutation, small, flat and external plates on their backs. Not for flight, for cooling. They were biological radiators, designed to catch the breeze, to dump the excess, metabolic heat, and to survive the new terrestrial inferno. And then the moment happened. The fall, the great accidental and evolutionary discovery. Imagine one of these small, radiator-clad insects, perhaps a hunter, pouncing from a high, fern-like leaf. It falls, but it doesn't fall chaotically. These new, flat and external plates, these radiators, catch the air. They create drag, they create lift. The creature does not tumble, it glides. It was a controlled descent, a whisper of physics. It was the invention of aerodynamics. This was the key. The radiator had become a rudder. Evolution seized upon this new, accidental and miraculous function. The radiator was refined. It grew larger. A joint was evolved at its base. A muscle was attached. The rudder became a paddle. The glide became powered flight. This was a conquest that changed everything. Life was no longer two-dimensional. It was three. The insects, the only life to have solved this problem, now owned this new aerial ocean. They exploded into this new, vast and unoccupied kingdom. And in this new kingdom, the very air itself was a different and far more supportive element. This was the Carboniferous. The oxygen level was not our thin, modern 21%. It was a rich, thick and soupy 35%. The air was dense. Flying in this world was not a frantic, high-energy battle against a thin, wispy medium. Flying in this world was almost like swimming. This dense, buoyant and oxygen-rich air was a form of rocket fuel, a metabolic supercharger, and it allowed for a new and terrifying and beautiful dynasty. The dynasty of the giants. This was the age of Meganeura, the giant dragonfly, a creature with the wingspan of a modern eagle, a four-winged, aerial and predatory glass, a monster of the upper air. Its compound eyes, each a galaxy of 1,000 lenses, were the masters of this new 3D world. It was the Thylacoleo of its time, an aerial, interceptor-class assassin. This explosive, aerial and giant-filled dynasty was a masterpiece. But it was a masterpiece built on a specific and temporary set of rules. This conquest of the air was not absolute. It was a conditional victory. These giant, armored and flying pioneers, for all their new aerial freedom, were still slaves. Their tracheal breathing, that network of tubes, only worked because the air around them was not just thick with fuel, it was thick with water. They were still, in their own, flying, armored and revolutionary way, prisoners of the damp. The giants had claimed the air. The Meganeura, the eagle-sized dragonfly, was the silent, glass-winged and predatory king of a new aerial ocean. But this kingdom, this Carboniferous dynasty of giants, was not a true conquest. It was a loophole. It was a temporary, climatic and atmospheric gift. These magnificent, armored and flying pioneers were not, in fact, free. They were prisoners. They had exchanged the small, wet and muddy prison of the shoreline for a new, larger and far more complex one. They were prisoners of the air itself. They were living in a humid prison. Their gigantism, their very success, was a symptom of this prison. Their size was not a choice. It was a consequence. The air was thick. The oxygen level at 35% was a rich, metabolic, and intoxicating fuel. It supercharged their simple, passive, and tracheal breathing system. This was the first lock on their cell. Their entire, giant-sized, and high-energy body plan required this super-rich atmospheric fuel. If the oxygen level ever dropped, they would simply and quietly suffocate. They were slaves to a specific and temporary atmospheric percentage. But the second lock was far more insidious. It was the dampness. This was a world of swamps. The Carboniferous was not a continent of dry, open and airy forests. It was a single, planetary and equatorial swamp. It was a world of vast, shallow and warm water seas, a world where the air was not just thick with oxygen, it was saturated with water. The humidity was perhaps a constant, dripping and inescapable 100%. And these giant insects, these masters of the air, needed this. Their breathing system, that perfect network of spiracles and tubes, was a fatal evolutionary flaw. It was an open system. Those tiny, closable airlocks were a brilliant solution to the dryness of a moment. They were not a solution to the dryness of a world. These creatures were, in their very physiological essence, leaky. In a truly dry, open and arid environment, their bodies would lose water, their essential internal moisture, with every single tracheal breath. They would, in a matter of hours, desiccate from the inside out. They had not conquered the land. They had merely and brilliantly conquered the swamp. They were, in their own flying, armored and six-legged way, just as amphibious as the green, leafless plants they had left behind. They were terrestrial, but they were still fundamentally creatures of the wet. They were a dynasty built on a single, fragile and perfect alignment of high oxygen and high humidity. It was a paradise. It was a magnificent, steaming and giant-filled greenhouse. But it was not a planet, and when the climate changed, when the air thinned, when the great global swamps began to dry, their entire glorious and giant-filled dynasty vanished. They were a beautiful, evolutionary dead end, a masterpiece built for a world that was, in geological terms, temporary. The true conquest, the great, final and definitive leap onto the dry, arid and permanent continent, was still waiting. It was not a story of chitin, it was a story of bone. It was not an insect's story, it was our story, and it began not as an act of conquest, of bravery or of ambition. It began, as all great evolutionary leaps do, as an act of pure, suffocating and biological desperation. The insect, in its armored, six-legged and giant form, had won a temporary, humid victory. It was a masterpiece, built for a perfect, swampy greenhouse. But the greenhouse was beginning to fail. The climate of the planet is not a static thing. It is a slow, breathing and violent engine of change. And as the Carboniferous age waned, the world began to dry. The great global and equatorial swamps began to shrink. The air, that rich, thick and 35% fuel, began to thin. The giants of the air, the Meganeura, suffocated. Their dynasty, built on a climatic loophole, was over. The true conquest, the one that would last, the one that would inherit the real planet, the dry and permanent and arid one, was still waiting. This was not a story of chitin. This was a story of bone. It was our story, and it did not begin in a glorious, sun-drenched, open ocean. It did not begin with a brave, curious, and forward-thinking fish looking at the shore with a sense of ambition, of wonder, of what if. That is a human and a modern and a false romanticism. Our story, the vertebrate story, begins in a different and far less noble kind of prison. It begins in the mud. Our ancestors were not the kings of the sea. They were the lobe-finned fishes, creatures like Eusthenopteron, and they were not adventurers. They were refugees. They had been pushed out of the vast, competitive and predator-filled oceans into the shallower, safer and quieter margins. They had found a refuge in the fresh water. The rivers, the lakes, the great shallow and inland deltas of the Devonian period. This was their new home, a quiet, green and watery paradise, for a time. But this new paradise, this shallow freshwater refuge, had a fatal structural flaw that the deep blue and stable ocean did not. The ocean is permanent. A freshwater river, a shallow inland lake, is temporary. It is a prisoner of the sky. It is a slave to the rain. And in the Devonian, the rain began to fail. The world entered a new, long and punishing cycle of geological drought. This was not a dry season. This was a dry age. The skies cleared, the clouds vanished, and the great, hot and unfiltered sun began its work. The water level in these inland paradise refuges began to drop. This was the new prison, the dying waterhole. We must imagine this scene not as a simple drying puddle. We must imagine it as a biological crucible, a concentration of death, a slow, suffocating and terrifying trap. The great winding river ceases to flow. It becomes a chain of isolated, stagnant and shrinking pools. The sun, that ancient, unfiltered fire, beats down. The water, once cool and clear, begins to heat. It becomes a warm, thick and tepid bath, and a warm bath cannot hold its breath. The dissolved oxygen, that scarce, precious and invisible fuel, begins to boil out of the water. The pool becomes anoxic. The fish, our ancestors, are now trapped. There are perhaps 100 of them in a pool that was once a mile long, and they are all in a slow, silent and systemic panic, suffocating. Their gills, that perfect feathery and aquatic machine, are now useless. They are frantically pumping a liquid that has no fuel in it. They are gasping in a world of water. The water, their home, their cradle, their very definition of life, has become their tomb. It has become a warm, muddy and suffocating soup. This was the motivation. This was the evolutionary gun held to the head of our entire lineage. It was not ambition that drove our ancestor from the water. It was necessity. It was a biological ultimatum. The choice was not, should I explore? The choice was, should I die here, in this hot, suffocating and muddy soup? Or should I try the other, the alien, the dry, the burning and the impossible world there? It was a choice between a certain suffocating and muddy death and a new, fast and horrifying one. The conquest of the land was not an act of bravery. It was an act of pure, lunging and biological desperation. It was a refugee flinging itself from a burning, suffocating building into the thin, cold and unknown air. The first step was not a step at all. It was a gasp. And to take that gasp, our ancestor had to have already evolved a strange and seemingly useless new piece of technology. It had to have a fin that could push. This was the crisis, the dying waterhole, the warm, suffocating and anoxic mud. Our ancestor, a fish, was trapped in a liquid tomb, and it was suffocating. This creature was a masterpiece of aquatic engineering. Its body was a torpedo, its gills a miracle of dissolved gas exchange, and its fins were a dream of liquid grace. A normal fish fin, a ray fin, is a delicate, paper-thin and collapsible fan. It is a membrane of skin held open by a series of thin, needle-like rays of bone. It is a perfect paddle. It is a tool for slicing, for sculling, for ruddering through a three-dimensional, buoyant and supportive world. It is, however, a tool of profound and fatal weakness. It has no strength. It cannot hold weight. It cannot push. The moment it touches a solid surface, the moment it leaves the water, it is a wet, useless and collapsible rag. But our ancestor was not a normal fish. It was not a ray fin, it was a lobe fin, and this one, small and anatomical difference, was the key that unlocked the continent. We see this creature, this perfect, transitional and beautiful ghost in the Devonian rock. Its name is Tiktaalik. At a glance, it is a fish. It has scales, it has gills, it has a long, finned and aquatic body. But it is a fish with a neck, a head that could move, independent of its shoulders. It is a fish with a wrist, and it is a fish with a fin that was not a fin. It was not a thin, collapsible and feathery fan. It was a limb. It was a thick, muscular and fleshy paddle, a structure of power. And deep inside this fleshy, muscular paddle, it held the secret. It held the blueprint. When we look inside the fin of Tiktaalik, we do not see a fan of thin rays. We see an architecture. We see, for the first revolutionary time, a pattern of bone that is not fish. It is us. We see a single, large and powerful bone, the humerus, connecting the fin to the shoulder. We see below that two parallel and supportive bones, the radius and ulna, and below that, a complex, fanning and articulated wrist of smaller carpal bones. One bone, two bones, many bones. This is the pattern that millions of years later would become the arm of a human, the wing of a bird, the flipper of a whale. This was the invention of the limb. But Tiktaalik was not an evolutionary prophet, dreaming of a future it could not imagine. It was not trying to build an arm. It was not trying to walk. It was a fish that was suffocating, and it was using this new, strange and powerful piece of equipment to solve its immediate and desperate and muddy problem. This fin was not for walking, it was for pushing, it was a prop. We must imagine this creature. It is in the hot, stagnant and oxygen-empty puddle. The air, that rich, clean and 35% oxygen fuel, is right there. One single, tantalizing inch above the waterline. But the fish cannot reach it. Its gills are useless. Its mouth at the surface is just a desperate, circular and ineffectual gasp. But Tiktaalik could do something no other fish could. It could plant its new, fleshy and bone-filled fins into the thick, resistant mud of the bottom. And it could push. It could perform in a single, desperate and world-changing act, a push-up. It was the first creature to ever use the ground to lift its head. It was the first step. A single, muddy and gasping push-up to lift its head, its mouth, just one precious and life-giving inch out of the dead, suffocating water and into the new, clean and alien world of air. It was a gasp. This was the solution. The fin gave it the leverage to reach the air. But this act, this desperate head-lifting and gasping lunge, would have been useless. A fish gasping air would simply drown on it. It had no way to use it. This entire, magnificent and bony solution of the fin would have been a complete evolutionary failure had it not been for another, even older and far more radical invention. A piece of equipment that, by a profound evolutionary miracle, our ancestor already possessed. A piece of equipment that came first. It was a fish that already had a lung. This is the central, beautiful, and backwards-running miracle of the entire conquest. We have the story wrong in our heads. We imagine the timeline as a simple, logical, and linear progression. A fish, Tiktaalik, builds a fin. It uses the fin to crawl onto the beach, and then, gasping in the new dry air, it evolves a lung. 1, then 2, then 3. But the story is not a line, it is a loop. The truth is far stranger and more elegant than our logic. The lung did not come after the step. The lung came first. Our ancestor, that lobe-finned fish, had solved the problem of breathing before it solved the problem of walking. The lung is not an advanced piece of terrestrial technology. It is an archaic piece of aquatic technology. It was invented not for the air, but for the water. We must go back before Tiktaalik to the ancestors of the lungfish. These were creatures living in those same volatile and shallow freshwater swamps. They were already, for millions of years, living in a world that was constantly running out of oxygen. The hot, stagnant, and anoxic puddle was not a new crisis. It was their normal, and their gills, in this normal, were failing. So, in a desperate evolutionary patch, they invented a Plan B. It was not a complex, beautiful, and multi-chambered organ. It was a bag, a simple, internal, and vascularized air sac, an outpouching of their own gut, their esophagus. It was a crude, biological, and internal balloon. When the water became a suffocating soup, these fish would rise to the surface and gulp. They would swallow a single precious and life-giving bubble of the air, and they would push this bubble down into their new internal and wet-walled bag. This bag, this proto-lung, was a simple, internal gill. It was a personal, internal, and wet-walled chamber where the dry, rich, and gaseous oxygen could meet the wet, thin, and waiting blood. It was a hack. It was a desperate, brilliant, and sloppy solution invented by a fish to survive being a fish. This, then, is the beautiful, accidental, and sequential truth. The lung was invented to survive the dying water. The limb was invented to reach the air that the lung could now breathe. The fin that could push, the Tiktaalik push-up, was not a gasp for hope. It was a gasp for function. It was the desperate, muscular, and bony act of a creature that already knew how to breathe the air. It just needed to reach it. This is the true, accidental, and perfect genius of the conquest. The two great and interlocking problems of the land had been solved in advance by a fish that was simply trying to survive a dying puddle. It was the most profound and most important evolutionary pre-adaptation in the history of the planet. Our ancestor, this muddy, gasping, and half-drowned creature, was now, by a perfect biological accident, a walking, air-breathing, and terrestrial machine. It had the frame, it had the engine, it had the hardware. It was, in all but name, the first amphibian. All it had to do was commit. It had to take that push-up, that desperate, muddy, and gasping lunge, and turn it into a step. It had to heave its entire wet and now functional body out of the soup and onto the stone. This was the first true and agonizing walk. The hardware was in place. The fin had become a limb. The swim bladder had become a lung. The desperate, muddy, gasping push-up of Tiktaalik had proven that it was possible. The bridge to the new world was built. Now, something had to cross it. And in the wet, green, and muddy swamps of the late Devonian, that crossing began. The pioneers were not a single, heroic creature. They were a strange, experimental, and fumbling committee of them. We find their bones in the Greenland rock, Ichthyostega, Acanthostega. These are the names of the first true tetrapods, the first four-footed things, our first true walking ancestors. And they were weird. To look at them is not to see a proud conqueror. It is to see a biological mistake, a creature of two worlds, belonging to neither. They were not fish. They were not lizards. They were something in between. They had the head of a fish, a heavy, blunt, and powerful skull. They still had the tail of a fish, a long, deep, and finned rudder, a clear aquatic signature. But they also had limbs. They had feet. They had, in a shocking evolutionary explosion of experimentation, fingers. Acanthostega, the fish with legs, had 8 of them, 8 thin and webbed fingers on each hand, a design that feels less like a hand and more like a rake. Its limbs were not the powerful supportive columns of a terrestrial animal. They were weak. They were floppy. This was not a walker. This was a creature that had built these new, strange, rake-like hands for a life spent in the swamp. It was a swamp gripper. It used its new 8-fingered hands to pull itself, not through the water, but through the thick, tangled, and submerged vegetation of the dying waterhole. It was a fish, that was learning to climb underwater. It was a failure on land. It was a step, but it was not the step. That, it seems, belonged to Ichthyostega. This was the walker. Its limbs were stronger, its bones heavier, its frame more robust. It was the first creature to truly and fully heave its entire, heavy and vertebrate body out of the liquid cradle and onto the stone. We must, for a moment, try to imagine this. It is an act of pure agonizing effort. The creature pulls itself with its new, shovel-like, seven-fingered hands onto the mud bank, and in that one single victorious moment, the tyrant returns. Gravity. The full, crushing and elemental weight of the planet. This creature, which in the water weighed nothing, now in the air weighed perhaps 40 or 50 pounds. Its spine, still the simple, flexible and fish-like spine of an aquatic creature, was not built for this. It could not hold this new, terrible weight. Its ribs were a massive, overlapping and barrel-like cage, less a breathing apparatus and more a solid internal and protective girdle just to stop its own heavy internal organs from crushing each other under their new vertical load. This creature could not walk like a lizard. It could not run like a dog. It moved like a seal. It was a creature of the heave. The walk was a painful, shuffling and agonizing process. Plant the front limbs, lock them, and then with a great muscular and whole-body lurch, it had to drag its heavy, wet and fin-tailed back half forward. A heave, a lurch, a gasp. This was the step. This was the conquest. It was clumsy. It was slow. It was inefficient. It was painful. It was a mess. But it was working. The creature was breathing. Its new internal and air-gulping lungs were firing in the rich, thick and oxygen-heavy air. It was standing. Its new, bony and internal frame was holding its own, vital, internal sea against the full pull of the earth. It was alive. It was on the land. And this land, this new, green and buzzing world, was empty. It was a world with no vertebrate predators. The terror of the Devonian waterhole, the giant predatory and armor-plated fish like Dunkleostraeus, the very things that had perhaps driven this creature from the water in the first place, could not follow it here. The land was not a hunting ground. It was a refuge. It was a safe, warm and sun-drenched place to bask. A place to warm its new, cold blood. A place to escape. This was the victory. This clumsy, gasping and half-fish, half-lizard this thing had made it. It had heaved its body onto the shore. It was breathing. It was safe. It had won. But this victory, this hard-won and gasping conquest, was a lie. This pioneer, this first great walking ancestor, for all its structural genius, was still a prisoner. It had escaped the physical prison of the water, but it was still and absolutely a slave to the tyranny of the damp. The first step was a heave, a clumsy, gasping and painful lurch onto the shore. Ichthyostega, our first true walking ancestor, had made it. It was breathing the rich, thick and oxygen-filled air. It was basking, safe and warm, on a land that held no vertebrate predators. It had escaped the suffocating, monster-filled and dying waterhole. It was a victory, but it was a lie. This was not a conquest. It was a parole. It was a prisoner who had been granted access to the prison yard. This great, new, walking and air-breathing pioneer was not a conqueror. It was an amphibian. And that very name, amphibian, means both lives. It was a creature of the biological compromise, a living, breathing and walking contradiction. It was a creature of two worlds and a true, final and definitive master of neither. It had escaped the physical prison of the water, but it was still and absolutely a slave to the tyranny of the damp. The first and most obvious chain was its skin. It had not solved the second great filter. It had not solved the problem of the dryness. Its skin was not the hard, waxy and waterproof cuticle of a plant. It was not the sealed chitinous and external armor of an insect. Its skin was still the skin of a fish. It was a soft, thin, permeable and living membrane, a skin that was, in its very essence, wet. This was the skin it used for cutaneous respiration, the ability to breathe, just a little, through its skin, just as a modern frog does. This was a fatal biological inheritance. Because it was a skin for breathing, it had to be wet. And because it had to be wet, it was a slave to the mud. Ichthyostega could not leave the shore. It could not strike out into the new, green and open forests. It could not explore the dry, vast and waiting interior of the continent. To do so would be suicide. The dry, thirsty and elemental air, the great thief, would have pulled the moisture from that soft, permeable and respiratory skin in a matter of minutes. It would have, quite simply, suffocated and dried into a mummified, leathery husk. So its life was a life lived in the splash zone, a life of heaving, gasping and clumsy lunges onto the bank, followed by a slow, desperate and necessary slide back in. It was a conqueror that could not leave its homeland. This was a profound and limiting chain, but it was not the real chain. The true and most absolute and most genetic prison was its children. It was the prison of sex. This new, revolutionary and terrestrial animal still reproduced like a fish. It had to. Its entire reproductive and biological hardware was still an aquatic machine. To create the next generation, the Ichthyostega had to return to the water. It had to slide its heavy, clumsy and land-walking body back into the muddy, familiar and ancestral soup. And it had to lay its eggs. These were not the eggs of a conqueror. They were the eggs of a prisoner. They were soft, gelatinous and shell-less spheres. A tiny, individual and personal pond. A small, trembling and permeable bag of jelly holding a single, tiny and developing embryo. It was an egg that had no wall. It had no defense against the air. It was, in its very essence, a droplet. To lay this egg on the dry, hard and stony land was to murder it. The air, the great, thirsty and atmospheric thief, would have descended upon this small, wet and unprotected jewel, and it would have stolen its water. In an hour, the egg would have been a dry, shriveled and dead speck of dust. So the conquest, for all its heaving, gasping and structural glory, had stalled. Life had learned to stand. It had learned to breathe air. It had learned to walk. But it was still, fundamentally, tethered. It was a glorious, walking and air-breathing amphibian with a long, invisible and genetic chain, tying it forever to the muddy, wet and dangerous edge of the swamp. It had one foot on the land, but its heart, its genesis, its future was still a prisoner of the water. The true conquest, the final and definitive and absolute severing of this ancestral aquatic chain would require one final and most profound invention. It was an invention that would, quite literally, package the entire supportive and ancient ocean into a box. Life had to invent the egg. The amphibian was a failure, a glorious, heaving and evolutionary masterpiece of a failure. It was a creature that had solved the problems of breath and of gravity, but it was still a slave. It was chained by an invisible, genetic and ancestral shackle to the one single, non-negotiable thing, the water. The tyranny of the damp was absolute. The reason was its origin. The amphibian, for all its new bony limbs and its revolutionary air-gulping lungs, still began its life as a fish. It laid a soft, gelatinous and shell-less egg, a permeable, jelly-like droplet. This egg could not survive in the air. It was a tiny, personal and aquatic cradle that would, in a matter of minutes, be desiccated by the dry, thirsty and elemental wind. The conquest of the land, therefore, was a fraud. An animal cannot conquer a continent that it cannot be born on. Life was at a stalemate. It had built a machine that could visit the land, but it could not live there. To win, to truly and finally cut the cord, life had to perform its single, greatest, and most profound act of engineering. It did not just need to build a stronger adult, it needed to build a better box. It needed to find a way to take the entire, supportive and ancient ocean and package it. This was the invention of the amniotic egg. And it is not an egg as we think of it. It is not just a shell. It is a life support system. It is a private, biological and terrestrial spacecraft. First, it solved the problem of the dryness. It invented the shell, a hard or perhaps leathery and protective wall. But this was not just a wall, it was a membrane. It was a piece of high-tech, biological engineering, a semi-permeable boundary, a Gore-Tex of its time. It was a miracle of physics. It was a wall that was at once strong enough to keep the internal precious water in, and yet porous enough to let the external, vital and gaseous oxygen in. The embryo was now waterproof, and it could breathe. Second, it solved the problem of the ocean. Inside this new, hard and breathable shell, it built a bag, a thin, delicate and membranous sac, the amnion. It filled this sac with a sterile, salty and perfect liquid. This was the private ocean. The embryo, the tiny, developing and vulnerable life, no longer floated in a dangerous, external and muddy swamp. It floated, safe and protected and buoyant in its own personal and clean sea. And it solved the final problems. It built a waste sac, the allantois, a tiny septic tank to hold the poison of its own existence. And it built a lunchbox, the yolk, a vast, rich and fatty supply of food, enough to fuel its entire complex and internal journey. This was the machine, the shell, the private ocean, the waste tank, and the food source. This was the final, defiant and evolutionary no. It was the severing of the final chain. Life no longer needed to return to the water. It could bring the water with it. The conquest was real. The amphibian compromise was over. And this new revolutionary and terrestrial machine needed a new revolutionary and terrestrial body. It needed a new kind of skin. The private ocean was built. The spacecraft, this perfect amniotic and life-supporting egg, was a masterpiece of reproductive engineering. It was the final, definitive and biological no to the tyranny of the water. Life could now be born on the dry, open land. But the parent was still a fraud. The adult, the ichthyostega, the heaving, gasping and clumsy pioneer, was still a prisoner. Its body was still a wet, amphibious and permeable machine. It had invented a perfect, waterproof and terrestrial cradle, but it had not yet built a perfect, waterproof and terrestrial adult. The amphibian, for all its structural genius, was still chained to the damp. Its skin was its prison. It was a soft, thin and living membrane, a slimy, glandular and respiratory surface. It was, in its very essence, a gill, spread thin over its entire walking body. It had to remain wet to breathe. And because it had to remain wet, it could never leave the swamp. It was a conqueror that was still, inescapably, a slave to the mud. This was the final interlocking piece of the puzzle. The true conquest required two inventions, the private ocean for the child and a waterproof suit for the adult. And so, in the patient, evolutionary and cellular factories of these new terrestrial animals, a new molecule was forged. It was not a structural steel like lignin, it was a sealant, a biological plastic, a tough, dry and defiant protein. We call it keratin. This was the invention of the scale, the birth of reptilian skin. This was not a skin as the amphibian knew it. It was not a living organ of breath. It was the opposite. It was a dead wall. It was a suit of armor, a shingled, overlapping and waterproof roof laid on top of the living, vulnerable body. It was a biological acknowledgement that the air was not a partner. The air was an enemy. It was a suit of armor, not against a predator, but against the air. This changed everything. This new creature, this first true reptile, was no longer a breathing surface. It was a container. It had sealed its internal, wet and personal ocean inside a dry, tough and permanent biological canteen. It no longer breathed through its skin. It breathed only through its new, efficient and powerful lungs. This was the moment. The two chains, which had for so long tethered life to the water's edge, were, in a single evolutionary instant, shattered. The genetic chain was cut by the private ocean. The physical chain was cut by the waterproof skin. Life had, at last, taken the final step. It was no longer an amphibian, a creature of both lives, a prisoner of the margin. It was a reptile, a terrestrial, a true and final conqueror. And this new machine, this dry, scaly and self-contained pioneer, this Hylonomus, this tiny, lizard-like and revolutionary creature could, for the first profound and world-changing time in 4 billion years, turn its back on the water. It could turn and look inland. It could look at the vast, dry, open and sun-baked continent, the world of stone, the world of green, the world of the waiting, empty and silent interior. And it could, at last, walk. The conquest was complete. The land was open, and this new, revolutionary and conquering design, this reptile, this amniote, in its very first and triumphant moment of victory, split. It split into two great and competing philosophies, two dynasties that would fight for the soul of this new, dry and conquered world. It was the beginning of the Great Divide. The conqueror had arrived. This new, dry and scaly creature, this amniote, was the master of the new dry land. It was a self-contained, waterproof and terrestrial machine. The chains were broken. The continent was open. And in that very first, victorious moment, the great, new and terrestrial dynasty split. It was a clean and fundamental divergence, a fork in the road of evolution, a choice between two completely different philosophies of survival. Two great families, born from the same conquering ancestor, now turned and faced each other, and they began a war for the planet that would last for 300 million years. The first, and for a long time, the dominant dynasty was us. We call them the synapsids. It is a dry, academic name, but it is the name of our own long, winding and forgotten family tree. These were not true reptiles as we think of them. They were the other branch. They were the mammal-like reptiles. They were the great and ancient and sprawling dynasty that would, eventually, after hundreds of millions of years of terror and darkness and near extinction, produce us. And we can see our first great and terrifying king in the Permian rock. His name is Dimetrodon. We see this creature in the toy boxes of our children. We see it in our books, and we get it wrong. We call it a dinosaur. It was not. It was not even a reptile. It was a synapsid. It was, in the truest and most profound and most calm, chill sense of the word, an ancestor. It is more closely related to you than it is to a Tyrannosaurus rex. It was a monster, a 10-foot, saber-toothed and reptilian-looking assassin. It was the apex predator of its day, and it was defined by its one great and beautiful evolutionary experiment: the sail, that vast, 2-foot-tall and skin-covered fan of bone rising from its spine. For decades, we saw this as a weapon, a threat, a display. It was not. It was an engine. Dimetrodon was a cold-blooded creature living in a cold-blooded world. Its rivals, the true reptiles, were slaves to the sun. In the cold Permian morning, they were frozen. They were sluggish, stiff and near death, their bodies a cold reptilian rock waiting for the air to warm them. Dimetrodon had a cheat. That vast, beautiful and intricate sail was a radiator. It was a biological solar panel. As the first weak and morning light broke over the horizon, the Dimetrodon would simply turn. It would turn its body broadside to the sun, and that giant, skin-covered and blood-filled sail would drink the heat. It was a vast biological and surface area designed to jumpstart its cold reptilian blood. It was a furnace. It could warm its body from a near-frozen stiffness to a predatory readiness in minutes, while its prey, the other sailless and sluggish reptiles, were still hours from being able to move. This was the synapsid philosophy. This was the first clumsy and magnificent external experiment in a new and revolutionary and world-changing idea. The idea of internal fire. The idea of warm-bloodedness. This was our road, but in that first great and Permian dawn, our ancestors were not alone. They shared this new, conquered and stony world with the other philosophy, the second great and competing dynasty, the sauropsids, the ancestors of the reptiles, the crocodiles, the dinosaurs and the birds, and they had a different idea. They did not choose the path of internal metabolic fire, they chose the path of external architectural efficiency. The first dynasty was us, the synapsids. We were the creatures of the internal fire, the metabolic furnace, the glorious and costly experiment of warm-bloodedness. Our sail-backed king, Dimetrodon, was a testament to this philosophy. It was a high-energy engine that required constant, massive and daily fueling. It was a life of hunger, of relentless demand. It was a brilliant but expensive solution. And in that same Permian dawn, the other dynasty, the sauropsids, made a different choice. This was the line of the true reptiles, the ancestors of the lizards, the crocodiles, and the creatures that would one day become dinosaurs. They rejected the fire. They chose a different, and perhaps for that world, a far more elegant path. They chose efficiency. The sauropsid was not a furnace. It was a mirror. It was a masterpiece of low-energy, solar-powered and cold-blooded design. It did not generate its own heat. It borrowed it from the sun. And in this it found its true and revolutionary advantage. The Dimetrodon, that great synapsid ancestor, was a slave to its own raging metabolism. It had to hunt every day. It had to feed its fire. If it failed, if it missed a kill, its entire high-cost system would begin to shut down. The sauropsid, that new, efficient and reptilian machine, had no such demands. It was a creature of patience. It could eat one good meal, and then it could wait. It could wait for a week. It could perhaps wait for a month. Its internal metabolic fire was not a raging furnace. It was a low, blue and pilot light. It was an engine that could idle. In a world of harsh, unpredictable and scarce resources, the creature that needs less is the master. The sauropsids did not just perfect their energy budget, they perfected their water budget. They became the masters of the dry. Our own synapsid line, our mammal-like ancestors, were still leaky. Our high-energy, warm-blooded engine required a constant, high-volume intake of water. We were still, in our own chemical way, slaves to the waterhole. The sauropsid, in its reptilian genius, severed this final internal chain. It perfected the skin. The keratin scales became a dry, shingled and impenetrable wall, a perfect biological seal against the thirsty elemental air. And it perfected its waste. It did not produce the wet, water-wasting and liquid urine of its rivals. It invented a new and far drier system. It created uric acid, a thick, white and non-soluble paste, a way to excrete its poison without ever losing its precious internal water. This was the winning design. a low-energy, solar-powered and hyper-efficient tank. A creature that could run on a single meal a month and that carried its own internal and sealed water supply. This was the machine that was built to conquer the new dry and open continent. And the war began. It was not a war of blood. It was a war of economics, a war of efficiency. And the synapsids, our ancestors, with their hot, hungry and thirsty bodies, lost. We were outcompeted. We were inefficient. We were the expensive, gas-guzzling models in a new world that demanded fuel economy. The sauropsids, these new, efficient and reptilian masters, inherited the earth. They took the day. They took the sun. They exploded into 1,000 new and terrifyingly successful forms. They became the dinosaurs. They became the pterosaurs. They became the kings. And our own warm-blooded and defeated ancestors were pushed into the only niche that was left. We were pushed into the shadows. We became small. We became nocturnal. We became the little, shivering and terrified creatures of the night. This was the Great Divide. The sauropsids had won. The land was theirs. The conquest was, at last, complete. Life, in its two great and competing forms, had claimed the final dry and vertical frontier. The platforms were built. The engines were running. But this new world, this new dry ocean of air, was a different and alien sensory landscape. A creature could stand. It could breathe. It could walk. But it could not yet truly perceive. To conquer the land, life had to do more than just arrive. It had to reinvent its senses. It had to learn from scratch how to hear the new silence and how to see the new, sharp and unfiltered air. The land was conquered. It was a new, dry and alien kingdom, now ruled by two great and competing dynasties. The warm-blooded synapsids, our ancestors, had claimed the shadows, the night. The cold-blooded, efficient sauropsids, the reptilian kings, had claimed the sun, the day. Life was standing, it was walking, it was breathing, but it was deaf. This new world, this vast, dry ocean of air, was a world of profound and fundamental silence. The pioneers, these first clumsy and land-walking amphibians and reptiles, were still prisoners of their aquatic past. Their senses were fish senses, and a fish does not hear in the way we do. A fish feels. In the water, sound is not a faint, airy and distant whisper. It is a thing. It is a physical, tactile and percussive force. It is a vibration, a pressure wave that moves with a powerful and physical integrity through the dense, liquid medium. A fish hears with its entire body. The vibration of a predator, of a struggling prey, is a feeling. It is a deep, resonant and bodily thud, transmitted from the water through the flesh and directly into the hard, dense bone of the skull. A fish's ear is just a small, internal and bony chamber designed to feel the vibration that its entire liquid and conductive body has already delivered to it. It is an animal of pure, profound and liquid vibration. And then this creature, this ichthyostega, this ancestor, heaved its body onto the stone. It left the dense, conductive and physical world of water, and it entered the thin, wispy and non-conductive world of air, and the silence that met it was absolute. The air is a terrible medium for sound. It is 1,000 times less dense. It is an acoustic insulator, a sound that, in the water, was a bone-jarring physical thud. In the air was just a whisper, a faint, thin and powerless puff of pressure. It was a signal that was too weak to move the body, too faint to vibrate the skull. The air, this new, dry and conquered medium, was a world of sensory deprivation. The first conquerors were walking, breathing and hunting in a silent, muffled and deaf movie. This was a new and profound evolutionary crisis. You cannot hunt what you cannot hear. You cannot escape what you cannot hear. Life had to invent from scratch a new and revolutionary and delicate piece of technology. It had to invent a receiver, a machine that could capture this new faint and wispy signal, the air, and translate it with a new mechanical power into the old, familiar and liquid language of vibration. It had to invent the eardrum. It began, perhaps, as a simple, recessed and leftover gill slit, a small, open and unprotected hole in the side of the head, a relic of its fishy past. A thin, delicate and internal piece of skin, the tympanum, was stretched across this hole. A drum. This was the first new and terrestrial piece of the machine. This drum was thin enough and large enough to be moved by the new, faint and airy signal. The whisper of the wind, the distant chitinous click of an insect, the scuttling of a rival, could now touch the animal. The air vibrated the drum. The silence was broken. Life could hear the air. But this was only half the solution. The vibration was caught. It was not yet delivered. The drum was vibrating in the new, dry and airy world. But the ear, the true, inner and liquid-filled ear, was still the old ear. It was still the deep, internal and bony ear of a fish. It was still waiting for a bone to hit it. There was a gap between the new, thin and airy drum and the old, deep and bony ear. Life had to build a bridge, a mechanical and bony and lever-based wire to carry the signal. And the material it used was a masterpiece of evolutionary and opportunistic recycling. It used its jaw. This was the new, central and engineering crisis. Life had built a drum, a thin, taut and delicate membrane, the tympanum, stretched across a hole in its head. This drum could catch the new, thin and wispy signal of the air. It vibrated. The first part of the machine was built, but the second part of the machine, the receiver, was still an old, aquatic and internal piece of hardware. The inner ear, the true, liquid-filled and neurological center of balance and hearing, was a fish's ear. It was a small, bony and fluid-filled chamber buried deep inside the skull. It was not designed to feel the air. It was designed to feel bone. It was designed to feel the hard, percussive and physical thud of a vibration transmitted directly through the solid, conductive skeleton of the skull. There was a gap. The new, airy and vibrating drum was a whisper. The old, liquid and bony ear was deaf. It was waiting for a knock. Life needed to build a wire, a physical, mechanical and bony bridge to carry the faint, airy whisper from the outside drum and turn it into a hard, solid and physical knock on the inside ear. It needed a lever. The solution was not an invention. It was an act of theft, an act of pure, opportunistic and evolutionary recycling. Life, in its genius, did not invent a new bone. It stole an old one. It stole a bone from the jaw. A fish's jaw is not a single, solid and simple thing like our own. It is a complex, modular and multi-part assembly. It is a toolbox of levers, of struts and of hinges, and one of these struts, a small, thick and rod-like bone called the hyomandibular, had a simple and ancient aquatic job. It was a prop. It was a structural brace designed to prop the entire gulping and mobile jaw assembly against the main, solid and bony brain case. It was a piece of pure, fishy and structural plumbing. But when our ancestor, the ichthyostega, heaved its body onto the land, this bone became a problem. The head was no longer floating in a buoyant, supportive and liquid world. It was now a heavy object, sitting on a neck, held up by gravity. The old, complex and modular gulping jaw was gone. The jaw fused. It became a simpler, solid and more structural clipper. And this one, small and rod-like prop bone, the hyomandibular, was now useless. It was an archaic, leftover and redundant piece of fish engineering, an evolutionary appendix, a bone without a job, and it was sitting by pure, beautiful and anatomical chance in the perfect spot. It was a leftover bone, floating with no purpose, in the exact, precise and microscopic gap between the new, vibrating and airy eardrum and the old, deep and liquid-filled inner ear. The solution was instantaneous. The faint, airy whisper of the wind, the signal that was too weak to move the skull, was just strong enough to vibrate the eardrum. The eardrum, in turn, pushed on this small, useless and perfectly positioned prop bone, and this bone, this new, solid and mechanical bridge, this lever, tapped. It tapped with a new, focused and amplified mechanical force directly against the liquid-filled wall of the inner ear. The bridge was built. The whisper had become a knock. This bone, this recycled reptilian and synapsid jaw prop, became the stapes. The first, and for a long time, the only bone of the middle ear. The wire was connected. The signal was delivered. The silence was finally and truly broken. Life, in its new, dry and terrestrial form, could hear. It could hear the dry, chitinous click of the first scuttling insects. It could hear the slithering, stealthy and reptilian approach of a rival. It could hear the wind. The conquest of the land required a new terrestrial body, but it also required a new terrestrial mind. Life had reinvented its hearing by stealing a piece of its jaw. Now it had to reinvent its sight. It had to find a way to make its old, wet and aquatic eye work in the new, dry and unfiltered air. Life could hear. The jawbone strut that recycled aquatic and bony prop had been reforged. It was now a wire, a bridge. The faint, thin and airy whisper of the new world was, at last, a knock. The silence was broken. But the conquest of the senses was not complete. Life had solved the problem of sound, but it was still blind. This, perhaps, was the most subtle and most profound of all the filters. The creature's eye, that beautiful, ancient and aquatic orb, was a masterpiece of oceanic engineering. It was a fish's eye, and a fish's eye is a wet machine designed to see in a wet world. In the water, the window of the eye, the clear outer cornea, is biologically invisible. Water and the living tissue of the cornea share the same density, the same refractive index. Light passes through the water and through the cornea as if it were one single and unbroken liquid. There is no bending, there is no focus. The cornea in the water is just a window, a protective, transparent and structural shield. The real work of seeing, the focusing, was done by the lens. A fish's lens is not the soft, flat and flexible disc that we possess. It is a perfect, solid and crystalline sphere, a glass bead, a marble of pure biological and refractive power. It is an orb of immense, rigid and focusing strength, designed to bend the light that the invisible cornea could not. This was the eye that Ichthyostega heaved onto the shore, a wet, spherical and aquatic machine, and in the moment it met the air, it failed. It failed totally and catastrophically, because the air is not the water. The air is thin. It is a different and far less dense medium. And in that single, terrible and physical instant, the invisible window, the cornea, was suddenly and violently visible. Light, traveling through the thin, new and airy medium, struck this new, dense and wet tissue medium, and it bent with a power and a violence that the eye had never been designed for. The cornea, this simple, protective and previously neutral window, had in an instant become the primary lens, a lens of immense, overwhelming and catastrophic power. And the old, powerful and spherical lens deep inside was still there. The creature, this new terrestrial pioneer, now had two lenses, a new, superpowered and accidental one on the outside, and the old, superpowered and aquatic one on the inside. The result was not supervision. The result was chaos. The world was a painful, searing, and incomprehensible blur, a mess of unfocused, massive, and distorted light. The creature was blinded by its own new terrestrial sight. The solution was not to add something, the solution was to subtract. Evolution, in its patient, grinding, and mathematical genius, began to weaken the internal lens. The old, powerful, and solid glass sphere became a disc. It became flatter, it became weaker, it became softer. It surrendered its old aquatic power and became a new secondary tool, a fine tuner. This new broken system was the new terrestrial eye, an eye of two parts, the fixed, powerful and external cornea, and the new, weak and adjustable lens. The blur snapped into focus. The world was no longer a mess. It was sharp. It was a new, clear and high-definition world of shape, of shadow, and of distance. Life could see. But this new, sharp and high-definition eye was a wet machine. This new, vital and all-powerful cornea was a living, breathing and cellular tissue. It was a gill, it was a membrane, and it was now, for the first time, exposed, naked and undefended to the air. The great thief. The eye, this new, precious and external lens, was now at war with the dryness. The wind, that dry, abrasive and elemental river of grit, was a sandblaster. The air, that thirsty atmospheric void, was a vampire. The eye, in a matter of minutes, would dry. It would scour, it would crack, it would cloud. The new, sharp and focused world would go white. The creature would be blinded once again, not by a blur of physics, but by a fog of dust and by the crust of its own desiccated self. Life had solved the physics of sight. Now it had to solve the maintenance. It needed a cleaner. It needed a shield. It needed to invent a plumber and a wiper. The solution was a masterpiece of biological and mechanical engineering. First, the plumber, the tear duct, a new specialized and internal gland, a tiny personal and desalination plant, a machine designed to pump a sterile, salty and antiseptic liquid, its own internal and private ocean, up and out and onto the surface of this new, dry and external lens. It was a system of constant, internal and self-irrigation. The eye was now permanently and safely wet, but the water, the tear, was not enough. The air was full of grit, the stone, the dust, the fungal spores. The wet eye, this new irrigated surface, was now a sticky trap. It was a sheet of flypaper for the world's new dry and aerial garbage. It needed a wiper, and so life invented the eyelid, a simple fold of tough, waterproof and muscular skin, a biological and movable shield, a windshield wiper, a machine that, in a single, rapid and unconscious blink, would sweep, with a mechanical and precise action, this new, salty and cleaning tear across the entire spherical and precious surface. It was a scrub. It was a reset. In a single, half-second muscular act, the eye was clean, wet, focused and safe. The conqueror could hear the new world, and now it could see it. It could see the shadow of a rival. It could see the hard, chitinous and new color of its prey. It could see the distance of the horizon. The sensory conquest was almost complete. It had mastered the vibration of the air. It had mastered the light of the air. Now it had to master the final, invisible and most ancient sense of all. It had to master the chemistry of the air. It had to learn how to smell. The conqueror was built, and its new terrestrial mind was online. It had stolen a jawbone to hear the new, thin and airy whispers of the wind. It had built a tear duct, a wiper, and a new two-part lens to see the new, sharp and unfiltered light. The world was no longer a silent, muffled and physical feeling. It was a new, clear and high-definition landscape of sound and of sight. But the final and most ancient and most primal sense was still a fish's sense. The conqueror could hear, it could see, but it could not yet truly smell. In the ocean, in that dense, wet, and supportive cradle, smell does not exist. There is only taste. Smell is taste. A chemical, a particle of food, a drop of blood is released into the water, and it drifts in a slow, liquid, and chemical plume. A fish smells this by tasting it. Its nose is just a simple, wet, and epithelial pit, a cup-like sensor that the water and its dissolved chemicals just passively drift into. It is a slow, close, and liquid sense. But the air is not the water. In the air, chemicals are not dissolved. They are volatile. They are a gas. They do not drift. They travel. They fly. They are carried with an invisible, three-dimensional and instantaneous speed on the wind. This was a new and revolutionary and far more complex sensory language. A language of distance, of direction, of a million new and subtle chemical words. The old, passive and wet tasting pit was useless. It was a cup in a world that was now a gas. The conqueror, this new dry and sealed reptile, needed a new machine. It needed a way to force this new, thin and chemical-rich air to meet its old, wet and ancestral senses. And, in a final, beautiful and profound evolutionary accident, it realized it already had the machine. The lung, that new, internal and air-breathing engine, had created a highway, a single, powerful and non-negotiable current of air. The creature had to breathe. It had to pull the new, dry and gaseous world into its new, warm and internal one. And so, evolution, in its opportunistic genius, simply moved the old, aquatic tasting pit. It moved it from the outside of the face to the inside of the highway. It built the nasal cavity, a new, warm and permanently wet internal chamber, a complex, scrolled and labyrinthine passage that was, in its very essence, a gill for the air. The old, aquatic tasting senses, the olfactory epithelium, were now stretched, vast and deep, inside this new, internal and protected wet room. This was the final, interlocking and brilliant solution. The animal breathed, and the very act of breathing, the very non-negotiable and life-giving engine of its new terrestrial body, was also the engine of its new terrestrial mind. The air, the wind, the language was now forced, with every single and rhythmic gasp, to pass over this new, internal and hypersensitive tongue. The creature was tasting the wind, and this new sense was a revelation. It was a superpower. It was a chemical map laid on top of the new, sharp and visual one. It was a story. It was the dry, musky and reptilian scent of a rival from 100 yards away. It was the faint, chemical and pheromonal promise of a mate carried on the breeze from over the next stony hill. It was the new, green and sharp smell of the plants. It was the dark, chitinous and alien smell of the insects. And, most importantly, it was the invisible, terrifying and chemical signature of a predator before it could be seen, before it could be heard. The sensory conquest was complete. Life had rebuilt its entire perceptive and conscious mind to match its new terrestrial and physical body. It had learned to hear the thin whisper, to see the sharp light, and to taste the new, invisible and chemical wind. The land was conquered. It was a new, dry and open world, and life, in its new, scaly and amniotic form, had finally and truly arrived. But this victory, this final 300 million year long and agonizingly complex escape, was not for some the end of the story. It was, in a strange, ironic and full-circle twist, just a detour. For in this new, perfect and conquered world, some of these new, terrestrial and air-breathing conquerors would, in a final, evolutionary and profound act of surrender, turn around and go back. The conquest was complete. The final chains were broken. Life, in its new, dry and amniotic form, was free. The scaly reptilian sauropsids had claimed the day. The furred, warm-blooded synapsids had claimed the night. The great, silent and empty continent was now a loud, complex and full-throated drama of competing terrestrial dynasties. The land was one, but the memory of the ocean remained. It was an echo, a whisper, a biological trace held deep in the new terrestrial bones and in the new air-breathing lungs. The land was hard. It was a world of constant metabolic cost. Gravity, the tyrant, was never defeated. It was only resisted, and that resistance required a constant, burning and expensive fire of calories. The air, the new, dry and chaotic ocean, was a world of violence. The temperature was a schizophrenic cycle, a freezing night, followed by a burning, sun-drenched day. Life on land was not a victory. It was a siege. It was a constant, vigilant, and high-energy war against the planet itself. And the ocean, that old, dark and liquid cradle, that ancient prison, began to look different. It was no longer a cell. It began to look like a refuge. It was stable. The temperature never changed. It was supportive. The buoyant water was a release from the endless, crushing and physical pain of gravity. It was safe. It was a vast, blue and three-dimensional world. A place to hide, a place to rest. The land was a world of effort. The ocean was a world of ease. And so, in the most profound and most ironic and most beautiful twist in the entire 400-million-year-old story, the conquerors surrendered. They began to go back. The first were the reptiles, the sauropsids, the great victorious and cold-blooded dynasty that had defined the terrestrial conquest. The ichthyosaurs. These were not fish. These were lizards, air-breathing, amniotic egg-laying and terrestrial lizards that, in a profound evolutionary U-turn, had looked at the new, hard and won land and had chosen instead the old, soft and easy sea. They did not just return, they re-engineered. They streamlined their new terrestrial bodies back into the old, familiar and aquatic torpedo. Their new, strong and five-fingered legs began to melt. The bones fused, shortened and were reabsorbed, buried deep inside a new, fleshy and fin-like paddle. Their new, powerful and air-breathing lungs remained. This was the new, strange and contradictory creature, an air-breathing, lung-filled and warm-blooded fish, a living, breathing and reptilian paradox. And then, in a separate, parallel and even more profound act of surrender, our own dynasty followed. The synapsids, the mammals, the most advanced, the most complex and the most terrestrial of all the machines. The warm-blooded, fur-covered and live-birthing masters of the new dry world. We went back. The ancestors of the whale, a small, wolf-like and four-legged creature, a synapsid that walked and hunted and breathed on the dry, hard land. And it too heard the call. It too felt the pull of that ancient, stable and supportive cradle. It stepped first into the swamp and then into the sea, and it committed. This was the final and most profound irony. The whale is the echo of this entire agonizing story. It is an air-breathing mammal that will drown if it is held for too long in the air. It is a warm-blooded furnace that must build a wall of blubber, a thick, insulating and biological barrier, just to survive the cold, stable and heat-leaching comfort of the sea. And deep, inside its new, vast and powerful flipper, if you look, you will find the bones. You will find the tiny, delicate and unmistakable finger bones of a hand, the hand of the walker, the hand of the conqueror, a terrestrial, five-fingered and structural miracle, now buried, useless and repurposed as a rudder. The conquest of the land was not a one-way street. It was not a simple, linear and triumphant march. It was an option. It was a choice. And the pull of that first, ancient and liquid prison, that dark, buoyant and comfortable womb, was so strong that for many, the greatest and most profound and most successful evolutionary journey of all was the journey home. This entire, sprawling, 400 million-year-old drama, this agonizing invention of the lung, the limb, the skin and the tear, this story of the escape and of the return, was not just the story of life. It was the story that built us. It is the foundation of the very world that we, in our own bipedal and terrestrial form, now inherit. The great 400 million-year journey is over. It was a story that began in a warm, suffocating and muddy pool of water. It was a story of pure biological desperation. It was a story of a fish, a refugee, a prisoner, gasping for a single clean breath of air. And in that one desperate and muddy gasp, our entire modern world was born. This was not a simple historical event. This was not a dry, academic and distant chapter in a textbook. This is our foundation. We, in our own bipedal and upright form, are the direct, living and breathing consequence of that single, ancient and Devonian crisis. The conquest of the land is not a story we tell. It is a story that our own bodies are. Look at your own hand. You are looking at the fin of Tiktaalik, the one bone, the two bones, the many bones. It is the same ancient and bony architecture, refined by 300 million years of evolution, but unbroken. It is the fin that learned to push. Take a single deep and easy breath. You are not breathing with a new or a modern or a human machine. You are breathing with a fish's lung. You are using the same ancient and internal air sac, the same Plan B that our ancestor, the lungfish, invented, not to conquer the land, but to simply survive a stagnant, anoxic and dying pool of water. And in your eye, the small, clear and almost unthinking drop of moisture that forms, the tear that keeps your vision clean and sharp and bright, that is not a human invention. That is the ocean. It is your own personal and internal sea, a living, microscopic and salty echo of the great liquid cradle that we, in our final audacious and evolutionary act, left behind. We are the children of the conquest. We are the walking, talking and air-breathing inheritors of a 400 million-year-old escape. We are the fish that learned to walk, the amphibians that learned to keep a promise, and the reptiles that learned to build a wall. We are the evidence. We are the living, breathing and conscious foundation.